I want you to picture the deadliest energy source on Earth. You're probably picturing a mushroom cloud, a melting reactor, green glowing barrels buried underground. Chernobyl. You're wrong. The deadliest energy source on Earth is one you drive past every day. One that heats homes, generates power, buries itself invisibly into the lungs of 800,000 people per year until they die. It's coal. And the reason we're still burning it, the reason we chose to keep burning it, is in large part because we were terrified of something that, by every measurable metric, is one of the safest energy sources ever developed. This is the story of the greatest mismatch between perceived risk and actual risk in modern history. And it is actively accelerating change. Let's start with a metric: deaths per terawatt hour, meaning, for every unit of energy produced, how many people die. It accounts for accidents, air pollution, mining, the entire supply chain. It's the most honest way to compare energy sources. Numbers are staggering. Coal kills approximately 24 people per terawatt hour of electricity produced. Oil, around 18. Natural gas, roughly 3. Nuclear, 0.7. Not 7.07. Nuclear power is, by this measure, roughly 350 times safer than coal, and comparable in safety to wind and solar. Read that again. The energy source that has generated genuine global panic, shut down entire national programs, and been weaponized politically for 50 years, kills, per unit of power generated, at roughly the same rate as rooftop solar panels. People fall off rooftops installing solar panels. That's in the data. Nuclear is right there with it. Now let's talk about the 3 accidents that haunt the public imagination. 3 Mile Island, 1979. The incident that permanently shaped American public opinion on nuclear power. The result of the worst commercial nuclear accident in U.S. history, 0 deaths. The containment systems worked. Radiation release was minimal. A follow-up study tracking 32,000 people living near the plant found no statistically significant increase in cancer rates. The scientific consensus is unambiguous. 3 Mile Island killed no one. The fear of 3 Mile Island, however, effectively froze nuclear development in the United States for 40 years. Fukushima, 2011. A 9.1 magnitude earthquake and catastrophic tsunami triggered a meltdown at 3 reactors. One of the worst nuclear accidents in history in the world's most earthquake-prone country. The confirmed death toll from radiation, 1 person. A worker who developed radiation-induced cancer years later. The evacuation of 154,000 people from the surrounding area, driven largely by radiophobia, not evidence-based risk calculations, caused an estimated 2,200 stress-related deaths. The fear killed 44 times more people than the radiation. Chernobyl, 1986. The worst nuclear disaster in history. A catastrophically poorly designed Soviet reactor with no containment structure operated recklessly during an unauthorized test. The UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation estimates around 4,000 eventual excess cancer deaths, a real and genuine tragedy. In the same year, Chernobyl killed 4,000 people over decades. Coal killed approximately 800,000 that year alone from air pollution. Every year, silently. Without a single headline, the scale of that disparity is almost impossible to hold in your head. But it is real, and it matters enormously. This is not a story about stupidity. This is a story about how human cognition works and how it can be exploited. Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent his career studying how people assess risk. What he found is that we do not evaluate risk rationally. We evaluate it emotionally, based on 2 factors: dread and unfamiliarity. Radiation scores maximum on both. You cannot see it, smell it, or feel it. It sounds like science fiction. Its effects, cancer, manifest years or decades later, making causation feel invisible and sinister. and it is inextricably linked in the public imagination with nuclear weapons, with Hiroshima, with annihilation. Coal smoke, by contrast, is familiar. Chimneys have existed since the Industrial Revolution. The deaths it causes are statistical, distributed, chronic, invisible. They don't make headlines, they don't have names. This is what Kahneman calls the availability heuristic. We judge risk by how easily a dramatic example comes to mind. Chernobyl is seared into our collective memory. The 800,000 annual air pollution deaths have no image, no narrative, no film, and the media amplified this asymmetry enormously. A 2013 study by researchers at Carnegie Mellon analyzed media coverage energy accidents and found that nuclear incidents received coverage approximately 100 times more intense per death than fossil fuel incidents. A gas explosion killing 30 people barely makes national news. A nuclear near-miss killing no one is a global crisis. We were, in a very measurable sense, trained to fear the wrong thing. If you want to see what happens when fear overrides data in energy policy, look no further than Germany. In 2011, days after Fukushima, German Chancellor Angela Merkel announced that Germany, a country with no coastline, no major fault lines, and no tsunami risk, would shut down all of its nuclear plants by 2022. The policy was called Energiewende, the energy transition, and it was celebrated by environmental activists around the world. Here, what actually happened. Germany shut down nuclear plants, which had produced clean, low-carbon electricity reliably for decades, and replaced a significant portion of that capacity with coal. German carbon emissions increased following the nuclear shutdown. Electricity prices doubled, becoming the highest in Europe, placing a disproportionate burden on working-class Germans. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Political Economy by economists Jarvis, Deschênes, and Gia estimated that the German nuclear phase-out caused approximately 1,100 additional deaths per year from increased air pollution. The coal burning required to compensate for lost nuclear generation killed, by their models, over 10,000 Germans in the decade following the shutdown. Germany had the environmental credentials of a nation that genuinely cared about the future, and their flagship climate policy, cheered by activists across the political spectrum, quietly killed over 10,000 people and made climate worse. I want to be precise here, because this is often misrepresented. Germany also massively expanded renewables during this period. Wind and solar capacity grew dramatically. The problem was that renewables, without adequate storage infrastructure, cannot provide reliable baseload power. Nuclear could have served as the zero-carbon bridge. They pulled the bridge down, while the new one was still being built. France, by contrast, generates 70% of its electricity from nuclear. It has the lowest carbon electricity grid in Europe, some of the cheapest electricity prices on the continent, and among the lowest per capita carbon emissions in the developed world. France made the choice Germany refused to make, and the data on that choice is unambiguous. This is always the question, and it is the right question to ask. So let's actually answer it with specifics instead of vague gestures at glowing green barrels. All of the high-level nuclear waste ever produced by every commercial nuclear power plant in the history of the United States, from the 1950s to today, would fit inside a single Walmart store. That is the entire accumulated nuclear waste of the world's largest nuclear power program. 7 decades. One building. By contrast, coal plants in the U.S. produce around 130 million tons of toxic ash per year. That ash contains arsenic, mercury, lead, and, here's the irony, uranium and thorium, making it, by radioactivity per ton, roughly 100 times more radioactive than nuclear waste. Coal ash is stored in open-air ponds. It leaches into groundwater. It fails. In 2008, a single Tennessee Valley Authority ash pond failure released over 1 billion gallons of toxic sludge. You probably don't remember it. On deep geological storage, Finland has already solved this problem. The Onkalo spent nuclear fuel repository, carved into bedrock 400 meters underground, is designed to safely contain waste for 100,000 years. It is built. It is operating. The unsolvable waste problem was solved in one country, because they chose to treat it as an engineering challenge rather than a political crisis. Let me give the counter-arguments their proper weight, because I think this debate deserves more than a one-sided takedown. Nuclear proliferation is a real risk. The spread of nuclear technology does create pathways for weapons development. This is serious, documented, and requires robust international oversight. It is not a reason to abandon civilian nuclear power, but it is a reason to have rigorous, well-funded non-proliferation regimes. This concern is legitimate. Cost overruns are real. Modern nuclear projects in the West have been plagued by delays and massive budget overruns. Vogtle in Georgia came in at double its projected cost. This is a genuine problem. But researchers argue it is largely a policy and regulatory problem, not an intrinsic feature of the technology. South Korea and China are currently building nuclear plants on time and on budget. The knowledge and supply chains that made 1970s American nuclear construction efficient were dismantled. They can be rebuilt. The new generation of small modular reactors, compact, factory-built designs with passive safety systems that physically cannot melt down, addresses both concerns. No moving parts, no coolant pumps. Gravity and physics do the safety work. They are in advanced development stages globally and represent a genuine leap. The legitimate objections are engineering and governance problems. They are not arguments for replacing nuclear with coal. The planet is warming. We know this. The window for meaningful action is narrowing. We know this too. And one of the tools that could have made the most meaningful dent in that crisis, reliable low-carbon baseload power, was dismantled by the nations that genuinely cared about the environment, driven by a fear that the data, comprehensively and repeatedly, does not support. That is the tragedy. Not that people were evil or corrupt or indifferent, but that people were afraid, in a very human, understandable way, of the wrong. And that fear had a body count. It still does. The future of nuclear is not the Soviet reactor at Chernobyl. It is not the boiling reactors at Fukushima. It is a technology that has evolved more in the last 15 years than in the previous 40, backed by the most consistent safety record in the energy industry. We chose coal over that. The question is whether we choose to notice.